My Airbnb guest set up a meth lab in my guest house, and it ended in complete disaster. This entire experience has left me with more trauma than I have ever faced in my life as a 65-year-old woman, and I regret the day I ever downloaded the Airbnb app. My husband and I bought a ranch together when we got married. After we had owned it for a few years, we had a small guest house built on the property. We lived such a carefree, peaceful life together. We raised our 3 kids on our farm and took care of a few animals as well. When I look back on our life together, I'm filled with gratitude and longing. I lost my husband to the virus a couple of years back, and I've spent every day since grieving him. I have a part-time job at a grocery store, and I have been living on my small paychecks and my husband's pension until this year when everything started going up. I live alone with only a couple of chickens and cows to take care of, but I found myself barely making ends meet. One of my coworkers pointed out to me that I had an entire guest house going unused, and I could make extra income by listing it as an Airbnb. At first, it felt like the unbeatable solution to all my financial troubles. For about a year after I listed it, I had plenty of lovely, well-behaved guests, and I was so grateful to find my footing financially as the cost of living continued to rise. Everything was going swimmingly in my life until I had one particular Airbnb renter book my guest house for an entire month. At first, I was happy to have my first long-stay guest. I had chatted with my sociable guests before and left them goodies like fresh eggs and milk. I got the house in tip-top shape, but when the guests arrived, things almost immediately went wrong. The Airbnb renter profile that I had seen in the reservation was one of a young girl's, maybe in her early 20s. Her profile seemed normal enough, but on the day of check-in, she arrived with 2 older men. On top of that, she herself looked very off. She seemed to be in a daze. I thought she might have been intoxicated or something since she looked extremely sleepy and was slurring her words as I handed her the keys. One of the men immediately swiped the keys from her hand, and then they both basically carried her into the house since she could barely walk. I instantly saw red flags go off in my mind, and I had this gut-wrenching feeling that I should have just kicked them out right then and there. Yet I didn't, and it would result in one of the most intense and vile feelings of regret that I'll have to live with for the rest of my life. They had only been staying in the house for about 4 days before they started inviting strangers over, and the next thing I knew the house was full of people 24/7. They blasted music, and I could tell they were smoking inside. It wasn't until they had been there for a full week that I noticed something was very wrong, and I was about to learn that these weren't like any other guests I had ever hosted before. My Airbnb guest set up a meth lab in my guest house, and it ended in complete disaster. In my first post, I spoke about how I rented out my farm's guest house on Airbnb and my most recent guests had proved to be a group of wild, disturbing individuals. They had rented for an entire month, and they constantly had strangers coming to visit and were throwing wild parties. One night, I was sure I saw a kid running around outside the house, but when I went to take a closer look, all the guests had gone inside. I mentioned before that they had been smoking inside my guest house, but after they had been staying for about a week, I noticed the smells coming from the house were getting more intense and hard to stand. I started to notice a very harsh chemical smell coming from the house, and within the same week, I found a bunch of my poor little chickens dead after the guests had hosted another group of strangers the night before. On top of everything, I started having breathing problems due to all the intense fumes. My chest felt tighter every single day that I woke up, and I was really beginning to struggle with the entire situation. Airbnb support had been no help, so after I found my chickens, I decided to call the cops on my guests. I explained the situation after they arrived, but they said there wasn't anything they could do. Even after showing the officers the dead chickens, they just shrugged and left. I felt so alone, confused, and scared since I was living right next to this chaotic household. Things kept on like this for another week, and the next thing I knew, I had been living like a prisoner on my own property for half a month. I cried myself to sleep many nights, missing my husband more than ever. One night I was crying, and I know it sounds crazy, but I suddenly felt like I heard my husband's voice in my ear. All I heard was Smith & Wesson. Again, I know I sound bonkers, but it's the truth. With the Lord as my witness, I would never lie on the memory of my sweet husband, and I truly felt like he was trying to protect me from the other side. Smith & Wesson was the brand of my husband's favorite shotgun. He had used it to hunt geese and would keep it in our bedroom just in case. When we first moved to the farm, he showed me how to use it. I remember thinking it was no use. I would never shoot this thing. But the night I heard my dead husband's words in my ears, I knew what I needed to do. I was racked with nerves that night, and was honestly feeling heartbroken and grief-stricken after hearing my husband's voice out of nowhere after so long. I got up and found my husband's shotgun, and propped it beside my bed. I fell asleep staring at it, my plan weaving together in my head as I dozed off. My Airbnb guest set up a meth lab in my guest house, and it ended in complete disaster. This was it. This was effing IT. I had finally had IT with the goddamned freeloaders that had been staying in my guest house for almost a full month. The chemical fumes that had started coming from the house 2 weeks into their stay were slowly unaliving me, and I was feeling more defeated every day. Until one night when I believe I was visited by my deceased husband, who told me to get his shotgun and deal with the issue once and for all. I knew all I had was myself, and no one was coming to save me from this hell. Before I fell asleep that night, I told myself I would bust into the guest house the following night, and shoot a single shot in the air to let these a-holes know that I was done effing around, and they needed to get the hell off of my property ASAP. I had been Googling about my situation, and eventually, I put it together that my guests had most likely set up a godforsaken meth lab in my guest house. That would explain the harsh smells and the impact the fumes had been having on my health. This final realization lit a fire under me, and I knew by the next night I would be kicking in their door, my husband's shotgun in hand. I considered that these people were obviously unhinged criminals, and that they might shoot me themselves the second I entered. Yet, even when I thought about being Jeaned down right there, I was happy I would at least die on my own farm, and that I would see my husband again. Even though I had spent the entire night and day hyping myself up to bust in their John Wick style, I never got the chance. Instead, their stay ended in flames, literally. I was inside my home around 6 p.m., my shotgun close by in preparation for the confrontation later that night. That's when I heard a colossal boom right outside my home. It shook the walls of my house, and a few of my windows even broke. It was one of the most alarming moments of my life when I rushed outside to see my guest house completely engulfed in flames. The entire house had exploded in a giant fiery mess. People were running out of the burning guest house still on fire, and the fumes were absolutely unbearable. I tried running away, but I collapsed from the chemical dust cloud that was consuming my farm. After that, I only remember waking up in the hospital. When I woke up in the clean white room, it felt like I had just risen from a nightmare. The nurse brought the cops into my hospital room, and they explained to me that, yes, indeed, my guests had been cooking meth in my home. I told them that I had called their fellow officers to my home weeks prior and begged for help, but they just cleared their throats and changed the subject when I brought this up. That's when they dropped a brutal bomb on me. To this day, I wish they just kept this detail to themselves since it was by far the darkest consequence of all this. Apparently, there had been a child inside the house when it exploded. A toddler. They had found her little charred body amongst the wreckage of my guest house. I learned that all the adults had fled the house, all surviving with burns of varying degrees, but they had abandoned the poor child in the house to die alone. I could barely control my sobs as they explained to me that they had found out it had been the child of the original woman from the renter's profile. After I was discharged from the hospital, I made the harrowing decision to sell my farm. The property was once a loving homestead that my husband and I put our souls into, but now it just felt like one big graveyard to me. I live with my eldest daughter now, and my life is tranquil once again. However, I am completely traumatized by the entire experience, and I'm going to miss my farm till the day I die. When I think back on the situation, there is only one single thing that brings me some semblance of peace. Before I sold the property, I created a little gravestone for the nameless child, and planted a massive bed of wildflowers all over the area where she passed. Lord knows I'll be grieving that innocent baby until we meet in heaven one day.